Esports podcast, noun. A 2-hour-long video full of banter and nonsense where the guests are only introduced halfway through and the outro makes you think your internet's died. Huh.
Right, this is going to be another one of my Patreon donated discussions. I will say at the beginning of this one, there was some scheduling issues entirely on my end, so there should actually have been more people on this one. But it's all right, we'll catch up soon and we'll do another one. People just get a free bonus episode. Because that's the thing, when I fuck up, things go better for everyone else, actually. So quite unique in that sense. I'm not like the politicians of this world, believe it or not. Right, on this episode, I believe neither of you have ever been on one of these. Am I correct?
I have not.
Have you? By the way, what do you want, just for the sake of the show, because obviously I don't have like the header or something, what do you want us to call each of you? What name would you like to be known as for this episode?
Bernogo's fine, just the same way that you rattle it off at the end of all your videos.
All right. What about you?
Shako is fine.
Yeah, okay. Right, so since you're both new, if you've seen any of the past ones, you know that I operate on the Fight Club type principle, plus you're the only people here, so you'd be shit out of luck either way. You have to come with a topic. Remember, the whole point is a discussion. In fact, if you notice, nowadays, one thing I'm actually quite pleased by is I don't really have to generate any of the topics. I will if people don't have one, I can come up with something, but I want to talk about whatever you guys want to talk about and see where it goes. So, Pronogo, how about you kick us off, mate? You have a topic or a question you want to start with?
Yeah, well, we were just talking about something a little bit before the show, and it made me think about a bit of a broader, not necessarily directly related to esports, although I can see a way to connect it back, is the idea of people basically selling out their ethics for the sake of lining their pockets, right? And getting a bit more clicks to their sites or whatever it might be. And one of the things that this made me think about was how it pertains to the actual games industry at large. And as a sort of like amateur upstart developer myself for video games, I'm actually trying to get into that in terms of game development. And pretty much everywhere I see is people who don't really want to do it for what I would call the right reasons. They're looking to get into it for money. They want to force a game to be an esport. That's why every game has all this multiplayer hype around it. So many games that are based around AAA developers. I mean, or even the term AAA at this point has almost become like pointless, even as a word. It's just a cliche. And it doesn't even really mean anything as far as the quality of the experience you get. So obviously this is represented by microtransactions more broadly speaking, and like the loot box openings and stuff. That's what you saw in Overwatch. But you also see just every game trying to be an esport, as instead of it just naturally happening, which is what, of course, led to some of the biggest esports in the earlier days, like Brood War, which is certainly my home game. And then, of course, the early iterations of Counter-Strike as well. These games were all sort of naturally demanding a scene to be built around them because of the quality, because there wasn't quality competition at the time, but also because they were pretty much the best things that we had at going into that point, in terms of like Counter-Strike being the de facto team-based FPS game after, Quake sort of fell off. And obviously, you know way more about that in terms of the history than I do. But the thought process that I have is like, instead of actually trying to learn from the examples, it seems like a lot of these developers, a lot of these publishers are essentially cargo culting the existing examples of high quality games and turning those into, like, trying to force them into esports. And I mean, I know that you've been vocally against the idea of like Overwatch as an esport in terms of its league, but I actually think that the game itself is just not even worth consideration on a base level. And I mean, I've got pretty extreme opinions about quality of games. I'm very much an elitist in that particular respect. So really, most games are not worth your time. I mean, it's just like the idea of, I think it's like the Pareto principle or something, where you have 90%, the top 10% do 90% of the work and so on. Sure. It's sort of like that with video games, in my opinion. It's like the idea of the top 10% of games are worth like 90% of the player base almost, or worth 90% of your time, whereas everything else is very unlikely to actually compete for your time in that sense. And yet, due to funding and due to, we'll say, corruption or backroom politics, games like Overwatch have actually managed to dominate headlines and get a lot of press and all this other stuff. So I don't really have a pointed discussion per se, but how do you feel about this whole thing? That. Yeah.
Right. First of all, before I do, since you referenced there that Brood War was the original game, etc., just tell us what games do you currently watch in esports?
Well, before the online era began, I was watching a lot of Counter-Strike, and I had been for several years. I think my first event that I watched was, I think it was like a Star Ladder before the PGA. Oh, it's not PGA. What was the Polish major that Gambit
PGL
won?
Krakow?
PGL, yeah, that was the one. So that was my first major, but before that, I think I watched a Star Ladder event or something. That was like the first event that I actually watched in CS. Okay. And actually, I came from League of Legends, which I know a lot about in the past, but I haven't followed it for a while now. Pretty much just watch Dom's co-streams from the LCS because that's entertaining, but the game itself is like not really grabbing my attention anymore. So it's really just been Counter-Strike and older Brood War games, not really like modern professional esports of Brood War, because I can't even watch the remasters since they destroyed readability for the game, so I can't even really follow what's going on anymore when they're using that skim pack. So it's pretty much just Brood War and CS, but not really anything modern, unfortunately. Not necessarily anything recent. I haven't been following the online events or anything.
Well, I mean, I think where I would come down on this topic is the main problem is kind of what you alluded to, which is it's almost an oxymoron to say you're going to create an esport.
Right.
Because like if you notice, especially in a world where people are doing it for money or status, you can't really create that. Like, we can create a hobby. You know, me and you can get together and we can play some old game, XCOM from the 90s on old IBM PCs, and we can make a little club and all this, because we'd be doing it as a hobby. We'd be doing it for our own passion, wouldn't need any money, doesn't have to have any infrastructure. Yeah, anyone could do that. Problem is, to create like a sport or something like that, you need to have then people who want to watch, and then people who are casual fans, and you need to have you have to have, as you say, coverage, you have to have press attention, you have to bring in the business side, you have to link aspects of the casual game with the professional. So I don't actually think it's even possible to do that. So to me, the crazy thing is, I think there's only two ways you can make an esport, and neither of them involve making an esport. Essentially, it's a knock-on effect. What you do is you either make a game that loads of people play. You reference League of Legends. The reason you don't watch League of Legends is it's not actually that good a game as an esport. Right. It's a perfectly fine game if you want to go and play Udyr jungle and just have fun in bronze or something. Yeah, anyone could do that. That's basically the reason the game persists as far as I'm concerned. But in terms of like an esport, listen, this is going to sound very elitist, but in my opinion, the main reason people watch League of Legends esports is they're like Amish people who've never been outside the village. They don't understand that a wider world exists. They don't know that a month put into Counter-Strike would have them looking back on League like, why the fuck would I ever watch the LCS again? I'm watching like banging tournaments every month, every few weeks. I'm watching the best teams, amazing match. Like, they just don't realize that they aren't just fans of League of Legends. Like, they're fans of competition and they're fans of that. And so I feel like they could kind of branch out. But luckily for Riot, at least, they've sort of created this little ecosystem where you don't even know you're living under the dome, that you're trapped in there. You think that is the whole world. Then I'd say the other way is just make a really good game. If you make a really good game, this is, by the way, the area that Counter-Strike filled for many years when it wasn't always number one or number two. Counter-Strike will always be an esport because worst case scenario, maybe it'll be the number 4 esport in the world. But the point is, similar to what I said before, but for different reasons, if you like Counter-Strike, well, that's it. You like Counter-Strike. You don't like esports and then Counter-Strike's the one that you're into. This is why I always told people when they were coming up, because by the way, you saw a lot of it publicly, but privately, you should have seen the amount of fart sniffing over Valorant coming out. People really were saying, no joke, industry people, it's a Counter-Strike killer. And I said, you're an idiot, mate, because the people who play Counter-Strike want to play Counter-Strike. They don't want to play a different game than Counter-Strike. They might for fun, in the same way as you might play Counter-Strike and then go and play League of Legends for fun afterwards. But Counter-Strike's your thing. It would be like saying you're going to invent a new sport. It's like, it's the basketball killer. It's like, mate, people are lifers in that sport. Like, what are you talking about? People play that when they're a kid for 25, 30 years afterwards. Like, they might do your sport as well, but the idea you're going to kill that sport if they love that sport, which is my point. League of Legends, I think they just basically, I mean, you look at the conversion rate, they've used scale to achieve their success. Also, one of the reasons why when they brag about the numbers, listen, they can brag, they're number one in some areas, but they're like the silver spoon kid bragging at that point in time. It's like, look at this. I've got a better car than you. It's like, well, yeah, I work a paper round. Your dad has millions. So right. Counter-Strike's, I mean, if Counter-Strike gets anywhere near the top, let's say Counter-Strike was number 2 or number 3. I mean, what more could you even ask? It doesn't even have China in it. It's fucking insane. Like, that's because people just love that game. So yeah, to me, this is why Counter-Strike actually is such a successful game, because luckily for us, Valve sort of figured out, since Counter-Strike and Dota existed before Valve, why fix what's not broken? Just leave it. It's doing great on its own. And in fact, even better than that, instead of having the nightmare that Riot has every time something fucked up happens in the game and a player says something, and you have to have like it reminds me of like one of those like Supreme Court hearings where they're just like, you must answer for your crimes, but then you just say what's got. Instead of doing all that, why not just let all the third party TOs run everything? Why not let them do everything, and then you just sort of loosely over the top come in every now and then and say, right, this is fucked up. But aside from that, unless it goes to that point, just let other people run it. And as you've seen, who's more competent to run an esports scene? I'd say the people who in Counter-Strike significantly so. Like, even the areas where they're not like, oh, but look, the studio for rights, yeah, they probably paid 10 times more for that. The other guy made his studio last week in that city and is going to take it apart and go to another city. Like, that's one area where you can always tell the noob motherfuckers in Counter-Strike, the pros I'm talking about here, because they're the ones saying on Twitter that they want the LCS for Counter-Strike. It's like, child, you know not what you ask. I saw this from Bobski. He did it on Twitter, I think last week or so. He basically said, like, he looks at, because of all the coaching bog abuse, he was sort of saying, like, he wants it to be like in League of Legends where Riot's done such a good job. And it's like, homie, shall I take you back to season 3 when if you came first place, you skipped to the semi-finals, played one best of 3, and then the only best of 5 was the final. And then if you went to Worlds the year before, it was best of 3 in the semi-finals, my dude. Like, this format is dog shit. What people don't know is Riot didn't invent or enhance any actual competitive aspects of esports. They'd started with the stupidest formats and systems at that point in time, when decades earlier there'd been way better ones. And it was only through continual criticism that, luckily, Riot are incredibly, insecure as a company, and they really do want to be loved. They want to go the way the wind is blowing. So as a result, after enough hammering on them, they've sort of finally done some things right or better than before. And then the idiots in those games just go like, oh my God, wow, amazing. Yes, what a great change. It's like, is it a great change? Like, to me, without going too obscene here, that's like saying, can you stop punching your girlfriend twice? And they're like, I just do it once now. They're like, well, got to give him props. He does only do it once now. It's like, that's how I feel about League of Legends. Like, are you for real? Like, can we actually wait till you do something before we give you the props? So basically, yeah, I'm with you. I think game devs that come in with that mentality, there's even something sinister about that. Like, think about the reason you used to make a game. When I was a kid, the reason why both the games themselves were incredible playing experiences, but more importantly, my field, games journalism, used to be amazing. Because games journalism was people like you and me, mate. And it was people who, they were in a bedroom and they were only doing it for passion. Yeah, they made money on the side, but if anything, that was like you get into it and then, in the same case of a programmer, you get into programming because it's fun. Remember, there's weird people out there in the world who that used to be their shit. Go read one of my favourite books by Stephen Levy called Hackers. It's basically about people who just sat in like MIT labs that you've never heard of, just coding obscure shit. Because that was like their version of playing Counter-Strike. They were into that. It was the shit. So if after that, you can get the lab to say, you know what, we'll hire you actually, so you can do that in your off time, and then also can you help some of the other students? And then if you're a guy who's a games journalist, well, you played every fucking game anyway, you have all these opinions, why not start writing? Why not get paid for doing it? That's the direction you do it to make the money. It's as a secondary consideration. If you do it that way, first of all, you can't lose. You'll make an awesome game, whether it has an esport or not. And then secondly, like, I actually think, quite frankly, you'll be the best. So the money will take care of itself. And then just to touch on what you said about Overwatch, here's the problem Overwatch has. Because it was made by a bunch of boneheads, they did 2 massive things that crippled the game. 3. One is they refused to pick a fucking mode. If they'd have just picked one of the 4 modes, and that just was pro Overwatch, I guarantee you all of this shit of like, you can't understand it and all that would be gone. That would be gone immediately. And I think teams would be way better in terms of the level of play because they'd be practicing one mode and then it'd be about the maps in that mode. This is like, what's mad about Overwatch? No one comments on this. In what fucking universe is the biggest sport in the world ever going to be like the decathlon? It never will be. But we're trying to make the decathlon bigger than soccer. It's like, are you out of your motherfucking mind? Half the people don't even play those modes in the solo queue if they can get away with it. They just want to play the one that they like. So to me, that was hubris on a level I can't even believe. Like, remember, here's the analogy. Imagine if in Counter-Strike, a series involved playing a hostage map, a bomb map, and an escape map. Again, the same fan. We all brag about how Counter-Strike's the easiest game to watch. The hostage mode wouldn't be. You'd have no clue what the fuck was going on if you'd never played the game. The one where you just shoot people and plant the bomb, that's easy. So to me, that already made like the burden of knowledge and understanding and how difficult it is for the pros. I think that's actually the hardest game in the world to play as a pro, especially since they added the whole champion pool thing. It's almost impossible to be the best pro consistently. Then secondly, what was the second thing? Let me think. Because the third thing I'm going to make the most money. I'll go to the third thing. The third thing is just, it sounds like an external matter. It doesn't matter. It was dividing up those Reddits, which, by the way, if you haven't checked, bad news for you. Valorant's already done that as well. The esports stuff goes in a competitive. This is called Valorant Competitive. And all the main just pleb clips, that's what the main sub is. So I'll tell you the only reason I came into League of Legends is because they had an enormous subreddit that an interview could go to the top of and get me loads of views. From there, I got into the scene and interested. Yeah, I tested the waters first. I would never have come into a Valorant or an Overwatch. So that is a big deal. That really will inhibit how much esports growth can come. Oh, I know what the second one was. It wasn't that they region locked. It's that they tournament locked. The idea there's only one league in the world and it is the Overwatch League actually kills that game. Because here's another spoiler for you. There's no esport in the world where the GMs are good enough. They couldn't even logistically be good enough at this point in time in history. But we're expecting them to be. The reason why it's not that big a deal that the NFL is a locked off league with only that many teams is because the people who are the scouts and the scouting staff might have collective 100 years experience. In esports, even when you collect the experience, it's like 5 years, 10 years. So as a result, there are always, and there always will be, one or two Korean teams who, are better than the worst Overwatch League teams. There might be a team in China that's better, but we just don't know because they don't play anyone good. There's always a couple of contenders teams that are better and in fact get scrims and beat the Overwatch League teams. So that's the dumbest shit of all time. Because right now, I'm going to guess most people would agree, there's probably zero teams outside the NFL that would beat even the worst NFL team. There's a reason why they don't do some massive $1 million Canadian Football League versus NFL League. There'd be no point. The good players go to the NFL. They didn't set that up. They did a terrible job in Overwatch. So in my opinion, these are all factors that you notice have nothing to do with the game. The game itself would be the same. But if you had one mode, a la Counter-Strike, I would have just picked a simple one. One of the ones that's very easy to understand. I'd have probably, by the way, what's the name of the one with where the cart goes along?
It's probably Escort or something.
Yes, Escort. I'd have probably picked that one because it would make it a unique esport. I always thought that was quite cool for the strats. It still has a team fight element, kind of like League of Legends, but still got the Counter-Strike aspects where you can attack all the time. And CES, as we say, where you just over and over again attack. I would have made that the one probably, because it would have given its own flair. So because I wouldn't pick the ones that are just more like Call of Duty and CS basically, because why would you want to be a poor man's version? I personally think the game itself, I even enjoy watching it to some degree, but I only enjoy certain modes. I only enjoy watching the best teams. So I think what would happen is in the same way as if you try following Dota, if you've never watched it, you have to watch a solid month or two before you really get to the good shit. I think you'd get to that if people watched it in Overwatch. So in my opinion, yeah, I agree with it. It'll never be a big esport. And these are all reasons why. People think I'm just hating on a game when I say, I'll never be big. It's I know the fuckers behind these games. Imagine if I showed you a guy who works in a restaurant, he's just tripping over, smashing all the plates and doesn't know how to cook. And then I'm this restaurant will never taken off. They're fucking hater, just wait and see. It's I don't need to, do I? What would the odds be? You have any thoughts on this, Shako? Do you have something you want to comment on, mate?
I definitely think that you can't really make an esport. It seems like it just happens organically. But one thing that I've noticed among all the big ones, and that it feels like you kind of have to have it now if you want to make it at least have a chance, is you have to make it where the beginning player can still have some agency, but then that agency will just never be as good as the really skilled players.
Kind of like Counter-Strike then, yeah?
Yeah, and specifically I'm thinking of Overwatch, where, if you never touched a PC, you can still do something with Mercy.
Okay.
Or with League, you can still do something with Lulu. But then, if you're Mercy and you come up against the best McCree, you'll never win.
Yes.
So there's still that way to separate that, because it just seems now I'm thinking of that Diabolical game that came out, and I don't know if you've played it, but I just think it's wonderful. But even they've taken steps to make sure that the beginner that comes in, which I consider myself, can still have some fun. So I think that's one thing I've noticed about trying to create an esport. And then the other thing that's tough, and which I think may leads into some of the corruption, is it felt at least my understanding was back in the day, if you made a great game, the number of games coming out was much more minor. So if you made a great game, I think it had a better chance of just standing on its own legs. Whereas now I feel like you have to have like some lightning in a bottle to get your game to be played massively by like, streamers or leagues or whatever. So I think part of it is where, maybe the businessmen try to focus way too much on that because, well, they have a point where that, important. I think they just go way too overboard and they kind of, eschew just like the really great like gameplay mechanics of what makes a great game. So I think that leads to part of the corruption, and overall, generally, you just can't really create a esport. I don't think it's really possible.
Well, the tough thing is, one of the reasons why they're so obsessed with it being an esport is because, like, let's face it, like the whole reason Call of Duty has that cycle where every year it comes out isn't just that it makes all the money. It's that the casual player probably stops playing after 6 months. Like, he's not playing for 5 years in a row. So they see it as a way to extend the length of the lifespan of the game. And obviously, if it has microtransactions, like Pronogo says, that's just a way to loop back and make you more money, which is basically the league trick. But then the other part is they also hope one day, it's obviously far from it now, that the esports side will be its own business, and in theory it could even be bigger, right, than the game itself. But I mean, that part at this point in time is something of a naive dream for most people, but one day maybe.
Yeah, one of the points that Shako just brought up about the fact that there's a consistent, like a dedicated push to allow entry-level players who have potentially never even touched a PC, never used a PC, to still be able to do something in the game. I feel like it's like a weird loop, this feedback loop, where you get people who demand that kind of thing or gravitate towards that kind of product where they are rewarded despite not having any skill. And then people trying to appeal to those individuals, trying to pander to those lower skill players who don't seem to really be interested in improvement. It's like a weird combo there because I don't know which came first. It's like a chicken and the egg scenario. I don't know if people started building games like that and then people got used to it, or if people just decided, hey, I'm tired of getting my shit pushed in Quake or Brood War. I would want an easier game to actually play so that I can, have some agency in the game, like Shako said. So I just look at it like, I personally have a more extreme version of this. Again, as an elitist, I would say I don't care if you don't have fun when you're first starting out with the game. Like, that's what a really good tutorial should do. Like, I've conceptualized a tutorial for an RTS game where rather than just sitting there and getting talked at by told this is your mechanics, this is your user interface, these are what these things do, you actually would be following along with another commander who's building up their base and doing things that basically a model for what you should be doing in the game. You're able to observe that, and because it's a low stakes environment where maybe it's a 1v1 and you're just there to support him, you're actually seeing that happen, seeing that play out, seeing what the scale of the game looks like, what the kind of tech trees are involved, and it's more natural, it's more organic. You simply just, at that point, you can figure out, oh, based on what he's doing, based on what my AI ally is doing, I can take a step further and try to just model him, to copy him, and then emulate him, and then improve upon that baseline. And another big problem or an extension of this is the fact that single player content, by and large, for all of these games, if it exists at all for esports titles, is really, really terrible at actually teaching you things. It's a really old example, but if anybody's played the original campaigns for StarCraft, they don't actually teach you how to play the game. They don't teach you anything about the user interface. You don't know about camera hotkeys. You don't know about control groups. Like, you have to dig through the help file in the game to even find out what some of the mechanics are. Like, just a couple of weeks ago, I found out a feature, and I've been playing this game since it came out in '94 or in '98. So I look at that, and I'm just like flabbergasted that this has not been communicated better to the player. Obviously, it's a very old example, but I think the same thing was true with tutorials in League of Legends, and I didn't even play the tutorial in Overwatch, but presumably there's a problem there as well, just by process of elimination. I would say, generally speaking, games like these have bad tutorials, and they don't the content that isn't related to fighting other human players, be it if the game even has bot support, the bots are usually terrible, and the engaging with them maybe involving them cheating, them map hacking, them having more information or more resources, or like pre-placed units or something, like some sort of advantage that you can't alienate, you can't remove from them. They just start out with this advantage, and you've got to grind until they're dead. It could be something like that. It could be a health multiplier or whatever, but the bots are usually not playing the same game that you are. And because the single player environment or the player versus AI environment is not a vehicle for tutorializing, for communicating information in an organic way, or even in a not super organic, but at the very least competent way that builds this sort of competence, that engenders this sort of this competence in the player's side themselves, they will never feel good enough to actually compete. They'll never actually be good enough to compete with a high skill player. So by lowering the skill floor, you don't actually solve the problem. You just kick the can down the road because, as Shako says, when you come up against a good McCree in Overwatch, it doesn't really matter how much you know. Like, if you're an earlier player, if you're a lower skill player, or if you're just a new player, you're going to get destroyed anyway. So, like, it doesn't even really, like, amplify or fix the problem in my mind. It's just an extension of the same problem. You're just pushing it further down and allowing them to sink a little bit more time in and maybe get hooked on something else before the skill punishment happens, where you're not good enough and then you maybe get dejected and you're like, oh, I don't want to play this anymore because it's too hard. And I just feel like if players themselves were willing to improve at the gameplay, the similar way where I think Counter-Strike forces that kind of improvement as a contrast to all these other games, I think that's one of the reasons why Counter-Strike is successful, despite the fact that it's not the number one, is because of the fact that the bots are not great, the tutorialization isn't great, but the players who gravitate towards it don't mind getting destroyed as much as players who gravitate towards these other games. And I'm not sure what you guys think of that.
I mean, it's the reason why, even though I think Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is an amazing martial art, there will always be more kids doing karate. Because if you just copy what the teacher says in karate, you can literally get the black belt when you could never beat anyone in the fucking world in the street. You get all the accomplishment, none of the actual graft. Whereas if you go to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the first class you are in, when you go in the sparring session, forget the idea, like, it's impossible you could ever win. You won't even last like 30 seconds.
Right.
Literally, like, the guy will just tap you out. Because remember, you don't even know the defenses, never mind the fucking grips and the holds. Like, you have no chance. So, but a lot of people can't handle that. Like they can't take just getting thrashed all the time. That's why I actually started doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, because I actually went to that, and when I had that feeling where I was getting tapped 24/7 all the first classes, I was like, this is Quake again. And the best part about this is, in 2 months, I'm going to be wrecking that new that was me. That's going to be awesome. Like, I'm going to be getting more wins, and I'm going to know, right, this means I've actually developed. I'm learning something. Like, that's an awesome feeling. But the problem is it's delayed gratification, isn't it? If you want gratification now, then that's the worst sport ever. If instead you go and you go, hiya, and he goes, oh, just a little bit more with the foot, and looks at his mum, who's like paying, like, yes, that's right. And, oh, yes, he's done it. Oh, Billy did it. Yeah. Let's all get pizza from the rich kid's dad. Like, that's a way better movie, isn't it? Everyone prefers that. I can tell you as well, by the way, sadly, the direction it came in wasn't, like, there was nobody out there who was really cynical and sat in a boardroom like, how do we get all the casual noobs? What really happened is really depressing, mate, which is both Quake and Counter-Strike basically dumbed themselves down and nerfed themselves.
Yeah.
Like, Counter-Strike itself as a game already was considered for Quake players like a noob-friendly game, but it wasn't designed that way. Like, actually, the whole point of the original Counter-Strike, actually, the spiritual game it is the successor of is a game called Action Quake, which is a mod for Quake 2. And the point is, it's like Counter-Strike, the rules, sort of, but you can do all the Quake fucking strafe jumping and stuff, so it's like way more arcadey. And in fact, early Counter-Strike was like that. Like, listen, everyone wasn't bunny hopping around every corner. That's exaggerated. Like, that's shit from public servers that idiots just worship for some reason. But you would definitely use air movement and acceleration and stuff like that. And guess what? It made you harder to dodge, which actually increased the skill cap, etc. Therefore, the weapons could be more powerful. Like when I tell you could instantly no-scope shoot the AWP and, like, switch over to another gun, that wasn't OP back then because everyone could bunny hop around and dodge it. Like, you needed a super powerful gun to kill those guys. So the big problem is, Counter-Strike itself just existing made an easier game, but then it got worse because the problem is, it's funny that everyone says Quake 3 is the best Quake, because if you played Quake World or Quake 2, it's the most diluted Quake, except then all the ones after that. Like, Quake 3 to me is like the bastardized version of Quake, because, like, the machine gun's overpowered at the beginning, most guns are fairly comparable, so you're always near a gun that's good. Like, these are none of the factors that exist in Quake World and Quake 2. But the problem is, this is the depressing part, mate. The person who dumbed these games down was the game dev, and this is way before they could have known it'd get more players. They did it because they were shit at the game. That's not an exaggeration. In Counter-Strike, for real, the developers, I went in the early days, and I know some of the motherfuckers who worked on these games. they were worse than any matchmaking player you play with now, because they barely play the game. They make games, remember, they don't play them. Like when they finish playing the game, they play, and even if they played, this is back when there was no matchmaking, so they were playing in a server with some friends, like fucking Billy from Texas, who's like a 45-year-old man trying to do like tactics that are like, Bravo Team Delta, go. Like they don't know what the fuck they're never even going to encounter me, so they're never going to know what a skilled player's like. So, dude, they would, no joke, this is not an exaggeration, they would do stuff like nerf the AWP, because they were having too many games where it's like, fucking AWPers, it's too OP. It's like, are you out of your mind? You don't even know what you're doing against it, you moron. Like, you're playing like shit. Like,
that's a League of Legends thing.
You know, you're crouching, spraying the AWPer, and he just goes slowly and just shoots you because you sat still. Right. Yeah, and then the worst thing is, Quake's the killer, mate. If anyone knows this story about Quake, they'll know why they've hitched their wagon to the wrong fucking steed. Because the people who invented Quake were two geniuses, and they were basically the Lennon and McCartney of esports, gaming at the time. And it was John Carmack and John Romero. And John Carmack was the tech genius. He made all the engines. To this day, he still makes tech stuff. But John Romero, he also was a programmer, but his strength was game design. He understood what was cool, what made a map good, what made a viewing experience. He understood multiplayer. He's the one who told them to put multiplayer. Quake was originally supposed to be basically what Dire Katana later was, like some super sprawling, mad, like FPS/RTS game going through history. But because of deadlines, they just made it like a way more limited, like FPS game. And then he put the multiplayer on, and obviously multiplayer is the only version that's ever played now. No one plays the fucking single player. So here's the depressing thing. Then problem is though, John Romero at the time had gone full superstar mode and wasn't doing any work, so they fired him. And then John Carmack was then the God Emperor, and there wasn't that creative tension anymore. So what happened after that is they made Quake 2, right? Quake 2 already started to dumb it down a little bit, but then this is the brutal thing. When John Carmack, here's the thing, when John Romero saw the multiplayer success of the game, he was into it. Dude, he used to actually post his demos of him playing. Like, there's a few of them out there. It's pretty cool to watch. He's not an amazing player or anything, but it's quite cool to watch a game dev go head-to-head with people and play them. When John Carmack saw the esports side, everyone knows that famous story where Thresh won John Carmack's Ferrari. John Carmack didn't go, this is awesome. This guy's like Michael Jordan. He legit, no joke, I remember this interview vividly. He did an interview where for Quake 3, he said, the problem with Quake is when the number one player plays the number two player and he wins by 30-2 scoreline, that's not interesting. Like, people aren't going to want to watch that. It should be like a basketball game where basically right up until the last minute, you never know who's going to win. Well, as a result, think of what he then implemented. Starting weapon's quite powerful. Every gun in the game has some utility and can be used in some... Like, the guy literally went out of his way to bastardize the game. And as you're saying, the reason it's so short-sighted is, yes, you'll get a lot of people through the door, but you know what? A lot of them will go back out the other door when they've played it for too long. So if you play a game that's for noobs, well, in 6 months, it's not fun for you anymore, is it? Like, it's like there's no fun being wrecked when you're 10 times better than that guy, but he just gets all these luck. Like, it's like, put it this way, there's a reason why Mario Kart isn't a major esport. Because it'd be stupid as fuck if people could blue shell you when you're the best driver in the world.
Right.
Why would anyone watch that sport? No. There's driving games, you know.
Too.
It's because that's sort of the feature they're trying to implement on a lower level, isn't it? They're wanting the noob to have a chance to win against anyone.
Well, StarCraft 2 is pretty much the same way, even to a further extreme compared to Brood War, when it comes to the fact that the game has been dumbed down. And it's not just like the normal Brood War diehard approach to this is, well, they added unlimited selection and they removed a bunch of UI limitations. I think it's more related to automation and the fact that when they did all of those UI enhancements, they felt self-conscious about the fact that you weren't forced to look at your base anymore due to Smart Rally. And so they have to add all these macro mechanics where you have to call down mules and inject larvae. And these are just chores. Anybody can do that. And you never are punished for doing it exactly on cooldown. You're only punished if you don't do it fast enough. And at that point, you are creating a more solvable game and less about skill expression, because I always should do this. It's never the wrong choice to do this. So of course, people decided at some point, like, this is just not the game for me, because the game itself is not even expecting you to display skill. It's expecting you to do chores on a cooldown. And that's just how you interact with the economy. Forget about the fact that, like, the units automatically clump together, so they're taking precise control away from how you move your units. Not that Brood War had the best pathfinding ever, obviously, but the idea that StarCraft 2 doesn't improve upon that and instead just makes units clump together, which improves the efficacy of AoE and all this other stuff, like, you know, obviously it's a completely different game, but the things that they changed about the underlying systems, where they automated player control away, when they made it so that, Again, it reduces the skill floor because any player can right click on their mineral line and build an SCV and it automatically goes there. Any player can do that. And, you reduce the amount of multitasking you have to do. And try to enforce some additional multitasking with these chores. Like it doesn't test skill. It just tests patience and it tests your ability to press some buttons on cooldown, which is unfortunately also the design philosophy that a lot of MOBAs have now, where they balance things around cooldowns as opposed to around like actual numbers and stuff. So
all I would say is this, mate. Let's take that as the test case example of what I just said. So remember, everyone in StarCraft was swinging their dick around in like 2011, 2012. The biggest esport in the world. Look, all those changes were good, man. Now everyone wants to play it. Yeah, everyone wanted to play it for 2 or 3 years.
Right.
Now you can't find a fucker who was one of those esports people back then who still plays StarCraft. I'm playing Counter-Strike. I played it for 20 years, mate. Like, this game can endure. And that's the reason why, is because at some point in time, now what you've done is, instead of it being like incremental, really hard learning curve, you've just put it on the other end. Now it's just diminishing returns or like tiny progress that you make. Because as you say, like it's so much of it's automated. So in my opinion, there's a perfect example of a game where, yeah, it did great to make the game big in the early days, but just didn't have the lasting power. It couldn't survive. And by the way, that's why you also can't ever praise any of these game devs. Because the only reason Counter-Strike and Brood War didn't continue to get nerfed is because they just stopped updating the game.
Yep.
They just only did they just fixed things that were like literally, if the servers broke, they fixed that. But that, aside, like the joke of Brood War is, the reason it's like probably the best esport ever is because they never patched it from the period where we actually consider it an esport.
Oh,
and no one cares about before 2001,
If you look into the actual mechanics of the game and the fact that they have RNG associated with height and like you can just miss a shot and that can actually decide games in the early game when you're trying to hold with as many workers as possible. And suddenly his Marine can't hit my worker every single time because I'm on a high ground cliff. And you combine that with the fact that you didn't even have support for north facing like reverse ramps in the game. They had to build it out of tiles, like scrap cobble it together with a third party editor. And as a result, the pathfinding flags themselves were messed up. And you actually have a situation where you could be standing on what looks to be the low ground, but you lose vision on the high ground, or it's all fucked up. Like on a mechanical level, it's not even functional. And they didn't bother adding that kind of thing to stabilize that after seeing the direction that the game went. They didn't bother generating new art, or at least like officially adding these shitty looking scrap cobbled together ramps into the game so that they could fix the problems with the assets themselves. They didn't bother doing any of that. And obviously, they didn't even bother fixing some of the other game-breaking bugs that we went on to find even in the remaster, even after the fact. So there's a lot of problems with Brood War, and I just think the sheer number of coincidences or the sheer number of like stroke of luck where Korea's booming into this economic splendor, and they have the best internet in the area at the time, and on top of that, it's getting big for a variety of other reasons local to Korea. Just like that was the game that stumbled and into success, really. Like that was Brood War's, or that was Blizzard's claim to fame for a long time, and they just never were able to replicate it because they didn't even do it by design. I mean, the engine was scrapped together in 3 months by one guy. So when you actually look into the process that created this game, you see a lot of really unfortunate sort of coincidences that dispel the myth that it was like a calculated move. And clearly, they never were able to make anything anywhere close as good in the future since then. So,
well, the joke is, just look at how Brood War ended. It ended because when Blizzard properly realized how big esports was over there, they tried to sue everyone and then shut the game down. Like, these guys are the dominant. I always say, like put it this way, in esports so far, there are barely any golden geeks, and they've all been killed, by the way. So, yeah, all by stupid American companies, and usually involving Korea, I've noticed, because that's the biggest fluke of all time. Without Korea, by the way, Brood War wouldn't even have been that big a game. Yep. You know, when people tell you all that stupid shit, like, Day 9 used to be a pro player, like, winning a World Cyber Games qualifier in 2005 is dog shit. Everyone stopped playing that game years earlier in the West. They were already playing Warcraft 3 like 4 years before that, mate. Like, he was playing, no joke. He was like the guys now. Well, I mean, actually, to be fair, Quick Champions has good money, so actually he's brought a few people out. But if you win in Quake now, sorry, no one will ever call you as good as Faker, because they'll go look at how many people you played against, even if it's a better game, So, right. Yeah, exactly. The fluke of that is like they never sat down there in wherever the fuck they're from in America and thought, Koreans are going to love this shit. Of course they didn't. That was pure fluke.
Nobody could have known anyway. So for sure, they never would have been able to consider that.
Right. What about, do you have a different topic, Shako? Do you want to say something on this one?
Oh yeah, one thing I just wanted to mention, and I do have another topic, but I really wish someone would make just like a very bare bones Counter Strike like open source, and I'm surprised no one has, because one thing I just love about that game is like the shooting feels so good and like crunchy, and you know
absolutely.
By the way, I forgot to ask you, what games do you follow?
Primarily Counter Strike, and then I'll watch a little bit of.
When did you start? Oh, what game did you say there?
Oh, I just watch a little bit of the rest of them, but I started watching probably, I think, right after the Olaf boost. I think that was
right. In that case, I've got some bad news for you, mate. And this is why. I mean, Diabolical is not a bad example. Although here's the thing: the one chance Diabolical has to succeed is on the Epic Games Store. You know, everyone's saying that's the bad thing about it. Yeah, those are people who don't understand business. That's the one chance it has to make it, because idiots might see it and they might already have the Epic Games Store and they might just buy it. And it might be on offer, and it might have discount codes they might give out, or it might have a 20% off and someone buys it, like a Steam thing. That gives it a small chance of making it. But here's the crazy thing, is when you're talking about these sorts of games, the idea of having, because the whole point of Diabolical is it's supposed to feel like how you want Quake to feel, but that Quake doesn't exist anymore. Well, here's the crazy thing a lot of people don't know. When CSGO was first coming out, like people started to first get to experience the beta and see screenshots of it, everyone who was a Counter-Strike fan in any version of Counter-Strike said, holy shit, this is bad. This is going to be so fucking... Because it was really poor, really poor. The people who made it had no understanding of what Counter-Strike was. And the brutal thing about it was the timing killed something else, which is long ago. I won't make this a super long story. Alex Garfield, the guy who was the owner of Evil Geniuses and created Alliance, and in fact helped Twitch be sold to Amazon, all sorts of epic things in esports. Basically, for a time, he kind of was like the, like, whatever the fuck that guy's, Mark Zuckerberg of esports in a way. He was some like young fucking arrogant bastard who just sort of had all the success, but did it in a way that was like, it's mildly unethical, but sort of you can get away with that in the corporate world, and was ruthless and wrecked people and did all sorts, some good things and some really bad things. So, well, really bad's going to sound like he killed somebody, just in my opinion, my very strict opinion. So here's what people don't know. For many years, he had been having developed kind of like a different version of that. And it was originally, it was being worked on the Source engine. That's how old this development process was. It was going to be, he was trying to make Source feel like 1.6 because he thought, right, the newer engine's going to attract the sponsors and all that. And then, but the feel's going to mean everyone can transition. Unfortunately, he took so many years on it due to a bunch of things I can't go into, like stupid he was trying to be too ruthless and harsh with the development team and backs and forth and people holding it hostage, that basically it only got a really good working sort of beta version right when CSGO was coming out. And all I'm going to tell you is this. The person who asked about this is Lurpis, Tommy Covenant, the guy who's now with IGC and MIBR. He played that. I even played the test version. Everyone who played the test version, eventually it was on the CSGO sort of, because remember, like, CSGO is sort of based on like the Source Gold and Source engine or whatever the fuck it is. So basically it was sort of the same engine, sort of, because it was from Half-Life 2, that CSGO ended up being on. And here's all I need to tell you. It felt just like 1.6. When you sprayed a Colt, a silenced Colt, it felt just like 1.6, that sweet feeling of like, you feel like you can control it, but it's intuitive where it goes. It felt really good. Whereas CSGO has never felt that good. And so unfortunately, that first shows that the developers of CSGO didn't get like the vibe and the intuition of CSGO. But also, it shows that it was possible to make a really good game in that engine. But then sadly, I mean, how was that game ever going to take off? First of all, it never came out, so don't worry about that. But it also never could have, because it also arrived in the generation when the only thing that got you in the tournament is that the game dev, said, well, I'll give like $1 million for this tour if you run it ESL. Well, they weren't going to do that. They had no money. They were just a small startup company. He was wanting to make money off it. Now, I will say, part of me is also glad that he didn't succeed. Because if you look at how that guy dealt with his companies, and by the way, the fact that the second it was worth a lot of money and he was sick of that project, he would just sell it to anyone. Well, I don't want a fucking tyrant like that running the game. Like I always said, the nightmare would be that you have some fucking Jeff Bezos type guy just owns the game and it's just his plaything. He can do whatever he wants with it. So there's upsides and downsides, but basically you're never going to get games like that, unfortunately, I don't feel like. Anyway, Shako, what's your topic, mate? Come on, give us a topic.
So one thing I wanted to talk about and get your guys' thoughts is, one thing I think about is the impact of like the majors and just kind of thinking if there never been majors, kind of what the effects would have been, and would it be like a net positive or a net negative? And sometimes I do think it would almost be a positive to have never had majors, and just because events like ESL One Cologne or
yes,
those are so wonderful to watch in their own right, at least in my opinion. And then I also feel like certain problems could just be fixed, and
without having to go to Valve and stuff. You mean?
Yeah, and one thing I think of that I imagine would be possible is I feel like a lot of the OP guns could have been fixed just by,
of course.
I feel like, I know ESL and like Face It don't get along, but I feel like they could have gotten together and created a build where just, when the Krieg's out of control, you just make the money. You just make that a $4,000 gun.
You just ask Valve, like, think about this. Imagine there was no majors, and so all Valve literally does is sit on the casual game and make money. But they give licenses, whatever, to the people running it. Imagine you could just say to them, right, well, since we're the ones putting the money in, and it's our sponsors, and we're the ones running it all, just give us a build for our tournament realm, that like in League of Legends, where we can tweak the values.
Yeah.
So, we just make the Krieg slightly less powerful, but you can keep it the same in Noob Play. That would be cool.
Yeah, so I just think that's like so wild that, majors are so prestigious, but then I do feel like if you kind of run it back, I do think the scene would have been better. And just the whole, like, for me, like a big thing is the coaching thing, because I think that kills so many like great narratives of like, just puppet masters behind. Because right now it feels like with in-game leaders, you try to just min-max skill and tactics.
Yes,
I think that's kind of ass. And I always think like, personally think it'd be cool to have coaches in-game leading for League of Legends. And like,
yeah, I agree.
I just think that'd be rad. So yeah, I wanted to get your guys' thoughts on
what do you think, Pronogo?
Well, as far as the coaching thing, I do think that it was a huge mistake by Valve to step in there and say that you can't have coaches behind the team. Like, it so heavily reduced the tactical skill ceiling, and I think that especially if we had the opportunity, like, this is my dream, by the way, the idea that we have not just an open circuit for tournaments, but an open circuit for like almost balancing the game itself or changing aspects about the game, like basically creating a pro mod like back in the old days. That is really, I think, the only way that you can truly balance an esport and make it so that it's still always testing the most skill and making sure that if there are any bugs or exploits, they get fixed as soon as they're reported, because you're not having to go through Valve and whatever publishing stuff that they have to deal with on their end, which in theory shouldn't be that much. I mean, they own not only the game, but also the Steam. Like, they own the platform that the game is on. So really, they shouldn't have to go through too many hoops to fix these bugs. But if anybody else can, if the tournament organizers can, then, or they can escalate it up to Valve or something, then that would be way better for sure. And, especially considering Valve makes quite a bit of money just off of the licensing, but also off of the idea that they have all those microtransactions and they have the whole skin economy itself. They're not hurting for money. They don't need to step in and make sure that they're the ones who are updating like the pro side of things. That I guess that's probably just an echo of the idea that for some reason developers think that the same conditions that pros have should be the same conditions of the casual players who are just playing for fun. There's so many developers that think that, or balance
almost all of them
like
do.
both at the same time,
Yeah.
So go ahead.
I was just saying that's where I feel like the money thing is nice in Counter-Strike, where you can just price things, to the appropriate level, and then if you're like a casual player, you don't really care that a gun's like more obtainable, but like at the same time, it still has like very beneficial effects on the thing. So that's where I feel like we really lost out, and just having the Krieg and the AUG meta just way out of control for so long, when that could have been nipped in the bud.
Well, yeah, because of course what Valve decided to do was, rather than try to rebalance the gun or just rebalance the price so that we would have legitimate options in addition to the AK-47 and the M4, I actually think that, for example, they did a really decent job improving the M4A1S so that you actually have a legitimate option. The only problem is that you would literally have to change your loadout instead of it being some other gun that you can pick up in the middle of the game. And if you want on a more affordable, less penetrating rifle, you can pick that. But at least it's a legitimate counter option to the M4 now because of its price decrease. Whereas if they had just done a price increase on the AUG and the SG, you wouldn't have the same problems that you had for so long, like you were saying, Shako, but at the same time, we would have still had legitimate options for using different guns. I mean, that's something that Valve themselves complain about and want all guns to be viable or whatever, but then they just nerf these things into the ground instead of keeping them as interesting but expensive and thus risky options to deploy in the middle of an actual match. And I think that's a way more interesting world to watch Counter-Strike in, is when you do have all of these different tools, but they're priced appropriately. There's an appropriate amount of risk associated with them, depending on how valuable they are. And it actually, feeds into the same kind of mechanics that you have in Counter-Strike anyway, like saving for an op to make sure that your star opper, like Kenny S or whatever, can actually use the op and get a lot of kills and have a lot of impact. I mean, that's like a core element of Counter-Strike in the first place, not just for watching, but just on a gameplay mechanical level. I don't see why they decided to go the other way. And that's a case where I think the obvious case to fix that would have been to just increase the price. Like Shako said, like many other people in the esports scene said during those the era of the Krieg and the AUG, the idea that you could just increase the price, that seemed to be a consensus among a lot of individuals. And at the very least, we could have tried it if we had the opportunity to create a pro mod or something like that. Whereas obviously we can't even know what would have been since Valve stepped in and did their own thing, seemingly not really caring about the feedback that people had. They just said, oh, people don't like the SG, but they didn't think, oh, people don't like this aspect of the SG, or this is how we can make it so that the SG is still reasonable despite the fact that people don't like it right now. They didn't try to identify an actual problem. They just decided to up the price and nerf the gun itself. So I don't know what was going through their heads, but that was like a case where they were very clearly boneheaded about the idea of balancing the game, in my opinion.
Right. In terms of the first part about whether we like a world without majors, basically. What's funny is this is where people who are, I know this is like before your time, people who are fans of all games, they do this mistake where they think that because something happened at a certain point in time, like it always had to go that way. So a classic example would be, I've actually been one of the rare people, this actually makes me almost an iconoclast. I actually don't believe that the creation of the LCS is why all the viewership went up and why it's a big esport. I actually think it just coincided with that because that is when they pumped even more money in, and then because they pumped more money in, then the teams could put more money, and then it became a whole thing. Like, in my opinion, you can never know what would happen if an open circuit had still existed, but the game was enormous. Like, I could have seen it being more like Dota, but with more views. Like, it's an open circuit, you have the best teams in the world going to all the tournaments, that keeps it super vibrant. Maybe the esports side isn't as big, because maybe some people don't like to watch all those, just like maybe they only want to watch LCS, but yeah, I've always thought that the idea those two things had to be together, I think they just coincide. I think that's a false correlation, in my opinion, or at least it's not the reason why it happened. So in similar fashion, anyone who was around at the beginning of CSGO is going to say, well, of course, you needed the majors because that's when the game really blew up and became enormous, and that's what made it a true number one esport, because before the majors, Counter-Strike was probably the number 3 or number 4 esport in the world. And in terms of viewership, it was getting nowhere near the sort of million it can get for the major. Now it's nothing on that level. So, for example, when people talk about Anders and Semler, when Anders and Semler started, they were in their bedrooms and they were getting 10k viewers or 5k viewers for like the best two teams in the world playing a match. Like, you know, maybe it was 30 or 40 in a good game. Like it wasn't what people imagine. It rapidly went up over the first sort of year or so, and obviously towards the end of the first year, well. And technically the game came out like August 2012, but towards the end of the first full year of it, 2013, is when the major came along. DreamHack went to 2013. The problem is it also coincided with cases and skins. So, I mean, that in itself was obviously going to have a big effect on the game, right? And I don't think that necessarily the major side is what pushed it as much as that. I'd probably say the skins aspect mixed with the gambling is what pumped more people into the game, and it's a brilliant game, so they just stuck around, or they started skin collecting as a noob and then got more into it and then wanted to use the skins and got more invested, sunken cost fallacy. So what I would say is I don't know if without the majors it would have been as big. It's not impossible. I think it just would have been slower, because one of the big things that having the major did do is they started to put it in the client and they acknowledged it. And so directly you bring in loads of people who just play the casual game to the esports side, whereas that person would never find out there's an ESL1 clone. You know, they just wouldn't know. Like, I know now they sometimes put tournaments that are not theirs inside the client. They only used to put majors originally. So essentially just that level of support was good. Another factor is basically that sort of veers into a separate abstract topic, Shako, which is basically a classic of mine, which is I'm not a fan of the one big world championship versus, you know, my favorites, the 4 tennis majors, the Formula 1 10 Grand Prix or whatever. I don't know if it's 10, but, you know, the idea that the more chances you get at greatness, but with all the best players, it's just more likely the best person wins overall, and consistency it makes you up. Whereas we all know, anyone who's watched League of Legends, every analyst, and funnily enough, the pros themselves, because they're all got Stockholm Syndrome, they'll all tell you FPX was the best team last year. I personally think you do a different bracket, FPX isn't even in the final. But that's just me. So, in my opinion, I see what you mean. If you take away the major, and now being the best team of 2019 is who won, I'll make up some events here, ESL 1 Cologne, or we'll pick a few others, Star Series Season 7, what else shall I pick? Has to be fairly big events. So we'll say maybe like, what was the big one? Oh, ESL Pro League Season 10. Say there was like 3 or 4 and they were the equivalent of, like, I mean, funnily enough, in Dota, they are called the majors instead of the international. If there was 3 or 4 tournaments and each was sort of like a mini major, I mean, remember, majors themselves were that originally. We used to have 3 a year. Yeah, that would be way cooler in my opinion. And I even think it's a more healthy and better scene. But again, that's longer term thinking, and that's about like the legacy of sports greatness. Every noob and every idiot in the world wants the one big championship where you roll all the money up, you roll all the viewers up, and people come and watch you, don't even follow the game. But to me, it's not like there's no value to that. It's just that's not the main thing I care about. So if I have to get that but compromise everything else, yeah, I'll say no to that, thanks. I don't want that personally. So yeah, I can kind of see where you're going on that. I could have seen a world where it could have developed separately without the majors and maybe been as good. It just would have taken a lot longer to get the same viewership, I think, and player base. So maybe it would have not developed as much now. But maybe there'd be other upsides to it, like you mentioned. And then in terms of the weapons and the coaching thing, I can do the coaching thing pretty quickly, which is, I totally agree. All that needs to be said is this. The idea, which is that, listen, the worst thing about Valve is they do tell us the reasons they nerf and buff things, and they're always stupid as fuck and never make any sense. So the reason they said they were nerfing coaches is not actually the idea that... it's not what people think that they claim, that, it's because, some teams wouldn't be able to afford it. That doesn't even make sense on the surface of it. Like, that's just a nonsense idea. The real reason is because they are so stupid. They think in Pro Counter-Strike, the guy with the coach that's really good automatically beats the guy with the bad coach, which we all know, like, that's not the way the game works. And the analysts and the casters, by the way, you can carry the can for this as well, because you kept repeating over and over again the stupidest myth of all time, which is that if we allow these coaches to IGL, it'll just be a genius IGL who's coaching and 5 sick aimers. Now, Counter-Strike will never be 5 sick aimers. It didn't even make sense on the surface of it. It's the reason why ENCE was way better than FaZe Clan last year. It doesn't make sense on the surface of it. It'll never be the case. And if it does happen, the game's so busted, I'll probably stop playing it, because that just wouldn't be interesting to me. So to me, these strawmans ruined that aspect, and that's why it was nerfed. Because I think if you had coaching, it would be like it was. There were teams like not FaZe back then, because it wasn't the FaZe you're thinking of. Like, they were actually a bad team back then. But there was teams back, like Fnatic's the best example, because Fnatic famously said we don't really need a coach. And the people they had did very simple things like map veto and selection. Basically, Fnatic did what they wanted in the server. They played how they wanted. A genius team like Fnatic, or how about SK when they let go of Zeus, they would still win. They could still be the best. But tell you what, if your coach is Zonic or Starix, yeah, you can be the best as well. It's another way the game can be played. Because if people don't know, at the time they nerfed the game, for most of that year, Na'Vi had been the second best team, and we're probably still a top 4, top 5 team. And Starix basically was one of the best IGLs, but he just didn't play the game. He was just a coach. And so that was what was great about it. It made the game better, not worse, because you could still be an awesome team with 5 players. Well, as you say, you min-max, so Fallen, maybe he wasn't the best at raw tactics, but he had a great feel for the game. He wins clutches, he's Europa, so he's got extra value, right? It's like having a quarterback that can run, but he might not be the best throwing quarterback. It doesn't matter. He's a double, triple threat. But the problem, in my opinion, is this. What you just saw with Heroic, where they just won ESL 1 Cologne, yes, because it's online, blah, blah, blah. You could have had things like that happen much earlier in the game. If Hunden could have just been the in-game leader and the coach, he could already have done this. He would have taken like maybe North and done that. So the people I feel really bad for is people like that. Because we all know there's loads of low fragging IGLs that are banging at tactics. Like, mate, the idea that if you're the team that wins, you have the best side, fuck off. You don't always. Or maybe you do, but because in the game now he has to frag, maybe that's how he supplements it. So I agree, maybe Glaive is the unicorn and he can frag and IGL. But you know what? I've said this a million times. The fact that Nico, and I know this, doesn't want someone like MSL leading him means that Nico doesn't understand Counter-Strike. He only understands his part in Counter-Strike. He thinks that someone like MSL isn't good because he doesn't get it. He thinks that it's better to have him just be half an IGL and frag twice as hard. Like, that doesn't even work. So, put it this way, there's a reason why fucking Lamar Jackson didn't win the Super Bowl. It's not as good as you think. So, people like MSL, I think an obvious example right now, if you follow his career, is Crystal from Godsent. I'll tell you one no one would think of, JT from Cloud9. Mate, if he could IGL, listen, not Team Liquid because it's just not the right team, but if he could IGL like a balanced team as the coach, they could win events. I'm not exaggerating. That guy's got really good tactics and got really good sense for how to develop them, how to build up a team, how to make them fit his team. But the problem is they have to frag as well, and that just kills them in the game. So I think, yeah, they ruined that whole side. That could have been so exciting. And just a brief thing to say on the weapons. If anyone knows any of them, I've once did a video about this. The other reason why I actually think Quake was ruined is something I alluded to before, where the idea of a strict hierarchy of the weapons was destroyed. Like in Quake World, the rocket launcher is the best gun. The lightning gun is the second best gun. After that, it's maybe like the super nail gun and the grenade launcher. Like, there's a hierarchy. If I have a grenade launcher and you have a rocket launcher, I have to be way better than you to kill you. But in Quake 3, if I have a super shotgun and you have a rocket launcher, but I meet you around close quarters, yeah, 50-50. I might beat you. I might get the kill. That actually ruins the game, because where's the strategy in that? If we all can get a cool gun and have a chance to win. Here's what would have been awesome. Imagine a world where they kept the Krieg at, let's say they only nerfed it 5%. A tiny little bit. But they put the price up just a little bit more. Let's say, so I'm not doing an extreme buff nerf to anything here. I'm putting price up, say $500, and I'm going to nerf, like, you know, a little bit of damage off it. It would still be the best gun, right? So here's what would happen. When you have full economy, or you want to take a really big risk when you have the money to buy it, you all buy the Krieg. But if we're in a scenario where we might not win this round and one guy hasn't got full money anyway, right, let's buy AKs. The hierarchy would be Krieg, AK, Galil, SMG. It would be like that, right? Instead, now everyone just uses the AK. Okay, cool. That isn't as good in my opinion. So I think it would have been a way better game. I also then, as you alluded to, strategically that makes it more cool. Maybe now there's certain maps, I'm thinking like obviously maps like Train and Nuke feel like it on CT side. If you can get to those orgs, you can lock the whole fucking map down. And you know what? At that point in time, unless they can get to the Krieg, they wouldn't be able to battle you. That's actually cool. But if I break your economy and you have to go back down, I get the Krieg. Now I'm back. I think that would be an interesting dynamic. I actually like that. I think that would add strategic depth to the game in terms of how you want to play. So, yeah, I mean, a lot to cover there. What's the next topic? Someone got one?
Well, just as a quick follow-up.
You can keep going on that if you want.
Yeah. Well, I wrote a piece a while ago when the AUG was the go-to gun, and one of the things that I argued about was the fact that it just felt, I mean, the headline was change without scope, which is obviously a play on the fact that the AUG has a scope. So the idea was that this weapon was buffed in terms of price, but not because, like, it's almost an issue that you alluded to at the very beginning of this show, but obviously it was a very different context where you talked about the fact that people who are into League of Legends and only League of Legends they're not aware. They haven't been made aware that other better games exist, better scenes exist with higher levels of competition, and that would be just as engaging, if not more, significantly more than League of Legends. Well, I think it's the same thing with pro players, where nobody was adopting the Krieg or the AUG, or if they were, it was like Elige before the Krieg buff, where he was occasionally using it and finding success with it, and he was the talk of the town, but nobody was really emulating him. Nobody was trying to study that to see. It's like the opposite of what I've been told happens in like European top LCS or LEC, right? Where they have the junglers, for example, will constantly like ask other people, even if they're from worse regions, like, oh, what do you think of this pick? What's going on here? This is an anecdote that I've heard repeated for a while.
Sure.
And so that's one of those things where I feel like it's pretty similar. It's like the inverse of that, where it's probably just an unfortunate byproduct of the fact that the game receives very infrequent balance changes. It's just that when they do happen, like you say, with Valve actually coming out and providing sort of context for why they do it, it's context where if you had ran that line of logic by pro players, analysts, just professionals at the top of the scene, they would have all said, all right, you're completely wrong about this. Here's some better solution. Or at the very least, they would have been able to pinpoint the fact that you're wrong and maybe some flaws in your logic. Whereas, of course, they're all internal. They don't bother actually trying to explain that sort of thing. So when they made this change, the biggest issue was that it reduced the skill cap or the skill floor rather, of the actual game, right? Because of the fact that you no longer have as much recoil, and the gun was much easier to control. And because of the fact that it was such a good gun, but was not priced reasonably after their nerf, or after their buff, I guess, to the cost, it's not that it was like fundamentally a bad gun by definition. It was just that the gun itself, one of the big anecdotes that was shared, or one of the big opinions that was shared during this era, was the fact that basically when you're using the AUG or using the Krieg, you're not even playing Counter-Strike anymore. The issue is partially with the gun, but more stringently the fact that they can access it so easily. And this is one of those cases where, like, I just feel like if you have a situation where the gun is always the go-to, like the AUG was always bought over the M4, the Krieg was almost always bought over the AK. There's a couple of people who were hanging on to like the original rifles. Like famously, Nico didn't bother doing anything with those advanced rifles until at some point, like right before they nerfed them, I think is when he adopted them or something like that. So there's some people who are hanging on to the originals, but at some point you got to realize if people are always buying something, it's not really a good reflection on the other roster of guns that you have. The idea that Valve wants every gun to be viable sounds good in theory, but the way that they go about trying to enact that change and make it so that all of the guns are viable always leaves one gun significantly more viable than the others, such that there is no contest. There's no thought process or logic that goes into it. It's just, do I have money? Yes. Okay, buy it. It's not like, do I have the situation where this strategy involves a fast hit and then I need more mobility, so I'm going to pick the AK over the Krieg because I move faster and I can turn corners faster. Like there was never any consideration about that, because the movement speed differential was so low, and the fact that you had way better accuracy and damage from the Krieg meant that it doesn't even really matter. It completely negates the negatives of that approach. So there was no actual thought process or strategic element of picking which tool for the job. It was just, this tool is the best tool, we're always going to go to that. So in some senses, like, you want the hierarchy of guns, but in other senses you also want tools that can be used for different purposes and benefit, especially with how varied the map design in Counter-Strike actually is, where there's a bunch of close quarter situations. Obviously, famously on Dust 2, there's a bunch of long situations where you're preferring rifles and ops and stuff. Like there's a lot of complexity and richness to the strategy of Counter-Strike by default, but when you change the tools up so that you're basically like bastardizing them, perverting them in a way that they're not actually reflective of their original point, it just ends up feeling like the developers, it's an illustration of their incompetence or just their ignorance, maybe, if the fact that is that they just don't understand it, which I think ties in nicely with what we've been talking about earlier in the show, where the developers themselves don't play the game and they nerf the game for stupid reasons, instead of it thinking and conceptualizing about the game balance as it pertains to top-level CS, which is what a lot of people watch. I think more people watch this game than play it, or at the very least, the numbers are competitive from the last time that I looked at those figures. So, it's turning slowly but surely into something like the NFL, where not nearly as many people play the game, certainly not at a competitive level, than compared to the number of people who are watching the game. And I think that's, the sport in that sense. But I think that's just going to happen eventually, and Counter-Strike could be a lot closer to that if they really pumped in a lot of focus onto the esports scene. And it's one of the reasons why it's a tragedy we don't have more maps, for example, or better formats, or better map rotations and stuff that you've talked about before, where like after the major a new map comes in or something like that. Like that would be way better for richness in the scene and incrementing change at a reasonable pace that doesn't invalidate the competitional, like the competitive integrity of it, which is why like when Riot patches something before Worlds, it's just a travesty, but they do it very regularly. So it's one of those things that you just have to come to expect, and that does invalidate the performance of players. Whereas obviously Counter-Strike doesn't have that, but they also have that weird issue with the guns where when there are changes, they're almost always bad, I think.
Imagine a world where there was a map came out in Counter-Strike where, except when you're in the bomb site or the spawn, you're never, ever able to see an area beyond inside the game 15 meters ahead of you, 10 meters ahead of you. So it's sort of like a catacombs or a maze or something, right? Instantly, SMGs become way more viable.
Right.
And you haven't changed anything about the engine of the game. You've just literally, what you've done again is you've given the person a different canvas, and now they're going to paint with a different palette of colors, as it were. That's already one way you could do these things. But obviously that, like, they're not even operating vaguely on that level, mate. Like the thing we just said right there, that'd probably they'd probably do that fucking meme of the guy's brain just exploding. Like, they couldn't even conceive of that. Like, they're still thinking that, like, DOS 2's Counter-Strike, so you're never going to get that, sadly. This is just for nerds like us to talk abstractly about. The crazy thing about the Krieg is this, right? I actually have certain areas Shako, do you ever watch League of Legends, mate?
Yeah.
Do you know who LS is?
Yeah.
Right. Basically, what people wouldn't know is I had a lot of backlash through a lot of my career, kind of like what LS gets, of like, well, people like to have fun and they like to do things that are square brackets inefficient and actually worse objectively for the game. But, that's just maybe because he's better than you, it's right. Or maybe, look, he won the game anyway. So you get like all the weird, like shit arguments against it, right? So two of them that are classics one is, obviously, I don't think that your worst player should ever be the AWPer. Now, all I'll say on that one is people tried to make a million excuses for Skadoodle and a million excuses for Smiths. And all I'll say is just go look at the championships. Everyone's going to think, what are you talking about? Thorin Skadoodle won a major. Only because the final is where he went ham. He was so bad in the rest of the tournament, he still ended up in the tournament with very mediocre stats at the end. He was not a top player.
So, I always think it'd be crazy if you took him out and then you got the equivalent of like Cirque at the time. Like, I think
it'd be godlike, mate.
That was one of the most wasted rosters, and like the fact that it blew up that team and then indirectly FaZe, I think that is actually a tragedy they won just for like the next year of that. I thought terrible consequence.
You mean in MIBR? Oh, sorry, you mean because they beat FaZe, right? I see what you mean then. Yes, okay. Yeah, you're right. That did beat. Mate, I guarantee you if they win that major, and even if they have all the same results afterwards, FaZe Clan, put it this way, Nico probably never kicks Carrigan. I guarantee you in all the losses after that, that was basically that moment was the black hole, and everything else, you could never escape the event horizon of it. And Nico was always going to kick Carrigan eventually. So, yeah, I'm with you on that one. So, first of all, like I say, you can't have your worst player be the AWPer. Just doesn't make sense. The other one, and this is one to this day, all the pros disagree with me about this, mate, except the rare few. You never give the fucking super god carry the deagle and the shit player the AK. Because super god players with the AK win the whole round. Yeah, they can get a kill with the deagle, but they win the whole round if they have the AK. And you know what? When they kill two people with an AK, go pick up their gun. It's like basketball, right? There's a great line my boy Kobe used to say, right? If you go to Kobe Bryant when he was in his prime and you say to him, you got to stop shooting, like that was a bad shot. Like you're only like 30% from there. He'd be like, well, yeah, but what are you from open 3-point? Like, what are you? You're not that much more than me. So you know what? You want the ball, go get the fucking rebound. That's what I think. But the problem with that is, mate, when you say that, just like Kobe Bryant, you're a bad teammate, aren't you? So loads of people don't want to play with you. Believe it or not, this is the thing people don't get. And this is something LS doesn't get. Most pro players, like humans in general, are bound in a prison of social shame and conditioning. So they do, first of all, what the others do, whether it makes sense to or not. Second, and which is why it's ironic that he actually got people to build fucking Leandries just by essentially sort of mildly bullying them, But it was effective. And then the other thing is, they also just want to have fun all the time. So they'll build inefficient things now. Like they'll build for like a power spike that's in 1 minute, but that falls off in 10. Whereas he's talking about, here's how you definitely win the game. So in the same sense, right, he would have a fucking aneurysm if he came and invested in Counter-Strike now and was like, wait a minute, what? This Krieg gun was there the whole time? Yep. The whole time! And wait a minute, you mean FaZe Clan never used it? The team with all the skilled aimers? Yeah, they didn't, mate. Like, because the craziest... Because here's the crazy thing. People don't know this. You referenced Elige because Elige used to sometimes use it conditionally.
Right.
Dude, the worst one ever is when Magisk was Magisk Boy and he was in Dignitas and that was when he first was really breaking out, was one of the best players in the world. And they won Epicenter, this is at the end of 2016, and they were established as one of the better teams, but they still had a lot of close losses that made they weren't the number one team. People forget this. He had a couple of months where on and off he would just use it for 4 or 5 rounds in a map and he would own with it. But that must mean legitimate, because think about it, Magus is one of the best users ever of that gun. Now, we know. That means that dude was using the gun, presumably to use it in scrims, and he just thought he was fucking around. And he really thought, well, I mean, if Nico and Cold Zero don't use it, I guess it's not the best, is it?
Yeah.
Even though he was a god with it. That is so insane when you think about it. Like, you don't even have to do the joke of, like, I'd go back in a time machine and use the Krieg. I'd just go back in time and go make his... This is how that works out, mate. And you just start dominating immediately, wouldn't he? He'd already be amazing. So, yeah, I agree. That whole area is just a nightmare. Do you have another topic? Oh, yeah, go ahead, mate.
Do you think there's ever a world where you stick, you just have like a Deagle specialist on a team, and that is all they use, and, they just inflate their money, and you just kind of understand that, you'll take some losses from not having 5 guns, but hopefully you're going to take some wins by being able to buy hero AKs on those rounds that you get like reset on. Do you think that would ever be? Like,
I don't think it's as stupid as people who are probably listening to this will think that is. Like, remember, they're all socially bound up in that prison as well. They're going to be, you idiot. The Deagle isn't as good as it depends what the situation is, mate. Like, I'll tell you what, the whole reason I knew that we would always have OP pistols in Counter-Strike is because even when the pros talk about nerfing it, they talk about it like it's a 1v1 game and it's 1 CZ versus 1 AK and at any range. They don't even give the range of the scenario. Whereas I always said this, the reason why you almost have to nerf the power pistols to be utterly broken at the pro level is because the pros don't use it the way the noob does. So if you make the CZ at all viable, pros are going to put 3 people around the corner when the AK comes round. And guess what? 3 people spamming the not very good accuracy CZ's going to get the kill.
Yeah,
so then we've got problems. Yeah. Whereas that's never going to happen in matchmaking, so you don't have to worry about it. So the main problem is, that sort of thinking. Oh, fuck, where was I going to go with that? Wait there a sec. Oh, yeah. So you know what? I don't think it's as silly as people might make out. Like, I'll tell you what, right now, when you say that, I've already thought of the first player who would do that role. And I think this would make... Exactly. Yeah. Imagine if he IGL'd, but he only used the Deagle, and he had extra money. So basically, unlike every other team, he can now give someone else a gun with a lower economic situation than any other IGL. And I've always said this, it never made sense how good he is with the Deagle, and yet how sort of like he's just he was exceptional with the Deagle and then just a good player with the AK. That's what even is that, mate? Like, if I put a Deagle skin on your AK, would you just be getting fucking 1-bullet headshots? What is this? What is this shit?
That talk you had with him was so depressing when you.
I know, wasn't it?
Because I wanted to hear like.
You thought he was going to have some advanced technique, didn't you? Yeah. He was sort of just like, I aim on the head and fire 1 bullet.
Left click on people's heads. Or what?
Yeah, exactly.
That was so depressing.
Because the saddest thing is, Rick, the reason why I gave him a chance in case there was a technique is because, as I alluded to, dude, there was a Swedish semi-pro, one of the fuckers who boosts Sanders if he streams, who told me basically his technique. And I even tried it. Basically, what you do is this. When you have the Deagle, obviously you don't just stand still. That's one way to do it. But say you want to be moving, you strafe, and then you have to learn how to perfectly, like, just hit the other counter strafe or time it. I'm not even good at this myself, mate, so I probably not explain it correctly, but this is the technical method. And as you do that, well, if you do a counter strafe, it basically, much quicker than if you just let go of the key, it can stop you instantly. If you learn the timing of that, that is how you essentially have the firing accuracy of being totally stood still while still sort of moving. And if you watch all the best Deagle players, most of them seem to know that technique, but the problem is they all know it intuitively. They can't explain it to you. And which is also one of the reasons, by the way, why you will always have coaches and there will never be the best pros all the time. In the same way as, like, the best tennis coach isn't the guy who could beat the guy he's coaching it with the ground strokes. Like, he wouldn't have the same technique, he wouldn't be as good, of course not. So, yeah, unfortunately, I'm not against the idea, mate. Like for example, you probably know this yourself from watching it. Do you remember when they had the G2 super team of Kenny S and Shocks?
Yeah.
Right, because Shocks was the IGL and his game was terrible. He fucked his whole game. Like, he became quite an average player. Because he was average, but his best player was Kenny S, on a bunch of maps like Cash, where you can take positions on CT where you are just like right on the corner, he would just play with an MP9 and he would just farm kills and have less money himself, spend less money just to make sure Kenny S gets as many ops as he can. Now, if you've got Kenny S, that even makes sense. If I've got Zero, I'd do the same thing. I think RPK even does something similar where he was getting in the Krieg by not buying anything on pistol around it. Like, these things work if you have the right player. Like, it's just a way you build the game out, isn't it? So I'm with you. Like, I'm open to those ideas, man. I don't think it's necessarily totally stupid. Maybe we're doing extreme examples because we're getting the absolute best guy, but You sort of see how it could develop. There could be a different meta than what everyone currently does.
Yeah, well, Boomich does the same thing, or did, back when Navi was playing on LAN anyway. He was like an MP9 specialist or something. Like, he was basically using it.
Yeah, he probably wanted to get simpler and up, right?
Yeah, and he'd farm cash, he would spend less money, he would save more money. It's exactly like what you're talking about there. So I definitely think it's reasonable. I just feel like the fact that we don't have the level of innovation, or even anywhere close to the level of innovation that we see in other esports games in Counter-Strike, is one of the really unfortunate aspects of it. And I have to wonder if it links back to like the concept of professionalism, where obviously, like, since it's not an expectation, and since esports is incredibly young, and since all the players themselves are usually skew young, there's really not a sense that I should be doing anything other than what everybody else is saying, right? They don't have that level. When we had I was about to call him Laser Lips, seriously, Laser Chickens on Peaker's Advantage, one of the things that he was sharing as an anecdote was that he more or less, like, he was just sort of caught off guard several times by the lack of professionalism with his team, to put it lightly anyway. And I don't think that that's just a situation there where he, like, it was just this one-off moment, or it was just in this one area.
What was the context? Like, give me an example. What was he? What sort of unprofessionalism?
It was mostly due to like how they keep themselves, whether or not they keep their space clean, whether or not they like are disciplined in areas outside of Counter-Strike. It's like pretty much they just focus.
Oh, mate, that goes to the top. That goes to the absolute. Like, put it this way, Astralis are a unicorn in that regard, and that comes, by the way, mainly from Zonic and the players, not from the org. The org will obviously take credit. Like, it's very rare that people are disciplined sportsmen, as it were.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be that much of a focus. Like, people want to emulate, and almost like we were talking about with games before, it's almost like they want to cargo cult Astralis without really understanding what gave them the success. And they'll point to things like, useful assets to have, like sports psychologists and training facilities. But if it's not coming from the player themselves, I mean, this is something that you find in life, generally speaking. If you're not willing to do the disciplined part of your life, you're just not going to find success, generally speaking, as much as anybody else. And they tunnel vision on a Counter-Strike specifically, but as I was, as I was referencing that Laser Chickens interview, the idea that he's, finding out that the players are not extending that discipline to other elements of their life. It's just one of those things where I guess you can't say you're surprised because these kids are so young. Generally speaking, they are actually kids most of the time. They're not even in their 20s in some cases. So you can't necessarily be surprised by it. But
if we had a lot more 30-year-old pros, there'd be less of it for sure. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, and I don't even think that like there's an argument against that. I mean, you see some 30-year-old or late 20s pros now. I mean, Steel, obviously. Like, you see these people who are getting on in their years relative to some of the entry-level players who are coming up, but that doesn't mean that they have to retire anytime soon. I think people have made convincing arguments on their own. Those players.
Yeah, but that's the problem, mate. There's too many people are just too horny for the 16-year-old Mad Aimer. And they don't realise that the Bymaster, like, he has, basically, he's like, I'm trying to think what the reference is. Like, do you guys know a game called Top Trumps?
I haven't heard of it.
No.
You'll know the reference once I say it, but that's obviously going to be the English name of it. It's a game where you each have cards, and the cards have different quality. Think of like a D&D character. There you go. How about that?
All right.
Like, someone like a Bymass is just someone who put all the points into fucking strength or something, and he's a warrior.
Mm.
Yeah.
But it's like he doesn't have any of the other strength. Like, he has no fucking... I can't remember what all the other, he doesn't have any of the others. Whereas the point is, to be a top pro, you can never just only have all the strength. Like, even someone like you think's a Mad Aimer, they've got to have some of the other elements. But that's the problem. We're just chauvinizing one aspect to such an extreme degree that we're basically cutting out 30-year-old people, because the 30-year-old people usually aren't the best in that one area anymore, but they have all this to offer elsewhere. But we're ignoring that. We're saying this is the one quality, and then we get them all in the pro play and then complain that they don't have all the other qualities. It's like, well, no shit. Like, listen, if anyone's watched any pro sport, there's always a guy, like, I'll give you an example. If you've ever watched the NBA, one of the best three-point shooters ever was a guy called Kyle Korver. If you could see how well he could shoot a three-pointer, in theory, based on his percentage, he should have been a star player, but he was always a sidekick because he didn't have the rest of his game. So that he could only do that one thing. And that actually wasn't as valuable as you'd think, believe it or not, because you have to set him up in a way. So, like, yeah, I think that aspect's mad up. Put it this way, without blowing my own horn, proceeds to instantly blow his own horn. But I just know the tune, mate. So I'd say this. The only way you'll see stuff like that change is when people like me become a coach, basically. But here's the thing. I don't know if I've ever said this on a past episode, but I'll say it now. I'm not against one day being a coach of Counter-Strike. I actually think, by the way, the game I'd actually have the biggest impact on is League of Legends, even though I don't know the game as well. So in Counter-Strike, I could obviously have a big impact. I could scout the players. In League of Legends, I just think I know a lot of Put it this way, the shit out, if you ever go back and watch some of my videos and talk show from 2014, I'm talking about shit that then everyone agrees on 3 years later. They just didn't get it back then. They thought I was just putting wild hypotheticals out there that were boring. So what I would say is this. I've been asked many times. I've been asked by teams that like then went on to win majors to be their coach. But why would I do it? Like, first of all, the main thing I want to do in life right now is do what I do, literally. I've had many chances to do many other things. I even do things that don't make that much money. I've like when I do a League of Legends talk show with Kelsey Moser, that's called an opportunity cost loss, if you know what that means. Like, I don't make money off that. Like, based on I could have written an article, I could have done my own foreign thoughts video, get the same fucking views.
Right.
10 minutes long versus 2 hours, and not also, obviously the other one's less popular because people found parts of it boring. So the point is, I do what I want to do. But part of me has always been interested by coaching because basically I agree with one of the premises that a lot of people don't. I'm not against the premise that LS has that you sort of need to know how to play League of Legends at high level to be a coach. Like, for his style of coaching, you do, because he's the God Emperor. For my style, you don't. But I do think that the reason why coaching is a fun concept is because otherwise, if you're an analyst, you're in the hypothetical. And in the hypothetical, you can always be the one that's right. But when you actually have to put it into practice, as my boy Papa Smithy's finding out in 100 Thieves, guess what? Reality is a fucking cruel mistress. She doesn't care how much people say you're great and that you know everything about the game and you'd be a great GM. She just cares about the results, mate. And so as a result, for basically analysis and content creation is the theoretical, playing and coaching the game's the practical. So I like the idea of testing myself in the practical world. I'd love to find out if I don't know what I'm talking about. But here's the other thing. First of all, my life condition means that if you're a coach, just realistically, you must go all in. When Fnatic asked me to be their League of Legends coach, they gave me the sickest offer ever in terms of they told me I could still do, like, say, a third or a fourth of my CS events. They'd let me have time off. They'd put in a sub coach for that week. So I had to tell them, unfortunately, listen, even if you're cool with that, the players won't be cool with that, the fans won't be cool with that. Even if we're winning every game, they're going to be like, but what more could we have done? Like, they're not going to get it. So I said, if you're a coach, you've got to go all in. So first of all, I'd have to want to quit being what I'm now, which I don't. But one day I might. Like, maybe I want to take a year or two out and I can always come back, right? But I'm also shrewd in that regard. I know that just like when I played a few games on Anders' stream and everyone rushed to see if I was any good, even though I hadn't played in months, and they were like, oh, he's just been put on Golden Over, because I played one game and we lost it against fucking global elites. They're going to be like, oh, see, I always knew he knew nothing about the game, he's shit. I have a way bigger stigma that's going to come with me if I become a coach. People are going to be waiting for me to fail. So there's two conditions have to exist before I'm going to be a coach. One is Moses' example. I've got to be given a team with the pieces to be number one. Because with my reputation, what's the point? What's the point in going in that world unless I can win? But here's number two. And this does apply to Moses, but not to the degree I want it. Like, Moses made a lot of money as a caster, but he was trapped in a world where he only made money for work he did. Now, if that sounds weird to you, he had no way to create wealth. He was just making a lot of money. And if you know the difference between that, I want like passive income. I want to create a brand. I want to do other things. I want to build something. All he could do was cast and get an amazing day rate, but that meant to make the money he made, he had to work himself to death. He had to do 300 days a year. Here's what I want to do. I'll be a coach when I get given a team like Team Liquid and my salary is $1 million a year guaranteed. And by the way, the last word is the one that's going to be the sticking point and it's going to make it take a few more years. I'm getting my money guaranteed. You can't fire me after 3 months and then say, it's like, if you hire me, we're all in for this year. So you may as well let me have full control. That money's guaranteed. So I'll do it in the future. If the opportunity arises, I'm looking forward to it. And tell you what, I'll put myself on the line and I'll take all the memes. If I'm shit, I'll literally quit after the first year. I'll let it go, whatever the case would be. But it'd have to be the right circumstance. So basically, if I am ever the coach, by the way, that's also one of the things I would immediately start with. I would literally start with, I'm imagining coaching didn't exist in this game. I'm not going to follow all the global meta. I'm not going to follow anything. Everything that a player brings to me, my analyst, they have to explain to me why that's the case. You can't tell me, no. But Chovy doesn't build that. I don't give a fuck what Chovy does. He's 10 times better than you at the game. That's skewing the method of what he's doing. The builds have to make sense. The lanes have to make sense. The comps have to make sense. Like, I'd try a lot of wacky comps, but I'd do it with my players' permission. What people don't get is this. When people think I just say opinions out of my arse. You think I haven't been like close friends with Fnatic players and who tell me what Reckless is like? You think I'm just making it up what it's like to be a Reapered player? I've seen the drafts that are like, fucking hell, this draft's shit, and everyone's like, but you can't know if the player asked him. I just go and ask the player, did you ask for that champion? Nah, Reaper just put me on it. I thought, fuck it, I have to just play it now. Reaper is literally at the expense of his players picking shit and then having them lose on it. Like, that's not what I would ever do. I would combine creativity and expanding horizons with what my players' strengths are. So basically, I'd take Reaper and a Youngbuck and I'd merge them into one, which is probably one of the most arrogant things I've ever said, but whatever. Just keep going in it. We've got another topic.
Yeah,
maybe this is the last one. Let's make it a good one.
Okay. I had one where I just wanted to get your thoughts on like a liege, because I feel like there's got to be times when Team Liquid's not doing hot that he's got to just be looking over and thinking like, man, it'd be pretty sick if like Breezy was next to me. So like, do you think he's just like a stoic guy for like staying in Team Liquid for so long, or I guess like it's just so odd to me that he's never even looked out at like other teams or going.
Sure.
Geniuses and thinking, let's win the major tomorrow.
Well, the tough part about that is it's a bit like why I personally don't know that you'll ever see Device be like a guy who goes to like FaZe Clan, for example. Even though, by the way, if in terms of his skills, he could thrive in that team. Could be godlike, could be the best player in the world, maybe. But the reason I don't think you'll see him or Elige do it is because part of players who choke like that early in their careers is they need comfort, and early on they have none in the big match. Like they're just another player out there, and they're just left to the fucking wolves. I think what makes them clutch is, first of all, yeah, personal development, but also if you're smart, you put the right teammates around them. You start to build the team that can support a player like that. And if you put the right teammates around Elige and give him that space to operate, then he's unstoppable. You can't do anything against him. I used to tell him when they used to be beating Team Astralis and be the best in the world, I used to literally like send him a message and just say, mate, forget everything that ever happened in the past when Astralis beat you. These guys can't fuck with you in the server if your game's on. You don't even have to worry about them. Just get your game going. They can't do anything against you. And it was true as well. So to me, the problem is, first of all, I think he wants like the comfort of same team, same manager, same everything, same fans, same teammates, same core. So he would be way less likely to do harsh cuts, in my opinion. Then you've got the factor that he's also someone where, if you know the stories of how he didn't get along with Simple, he doesn't value in-game stuff over all out-game stuff. You also have to be able to get along with him. There has to be a good social vibe. He's actually kind of a bit Nordic in that regard. It's not really the American way. So I actually don't like, for example, I can't comment on Cirque because actually I know Cirque's a cool guy, but I wouldn't know what he'd be like as a teammate. So maybe he wouldn't want a teammate like Cirque. Maybe Cirque just goes wild and starts screaming when he does stuff. Maybe that's not Alicia's bag, Kind of like famously, if everyone knows the story, the first time Makalele was kicked from NIP, he didn't do anything wrong and he wasn't playing badly. It's just that some players, in my opinion, it was Get Right and some other people, they just didn't like it when people were the odd man out socially. They wanted a guy who they liked as a friend. So they were willing to go. So the reason they got Alu is he just didn't have a personality, did he? So he couldn't annoy you. He's just a fucking robot. So just put him there. Now we've got one less problem. Cool. It's like, that's why I've always thought, listen, aside from the fact he does do some cool stuff as like a role player, one of the biggest factors that no one tells you about RPK that makes him amazing is he's also a fucking robot who doesn't talk. Well, guess what? If you don't talk, I can never have an argument with you. I can never get annoyed. Like, it's cool. You do what you're told. Great. Everyone loves people like that to work with them when they're the fucking big ego star player, Yeah. One of the reasons why Nico was almost like, one of the reasons why Nico wanted Olaf to be his hetero life mate, to steal a term from the View-Ask universe, is because Olaf at that point in time was the coolest teammate ever. He just did his job, never complained, did all the shit rolls, bottom fragged, and then goes, wow, Nico, great game. He's like, yeah, you are a good teammate, Olaf. He's just a fucking, even though it's actually because he's a cool guy, he's basically a sycophant to you moron. Like, why are you such a caricature of a star player ego gone mad? Why are you this way, Nico? Because I always say, I used to feel so bad for Nico when he was in Mouse Sports. Nico in post-Carrigan FaZe Clan, it's like, mate, you're Satan in hell. You made this shit. You can't complain. You're the one who made it like that and you rule over it. How can you then complain? You can't.
Yeah, especially when you consider that people, I feel like to this day, would still love to play with Nico. Like, he has so much attraction.
So many people want to play with him, mate.
Yeah.
Put it this way, bearing in mind Simple has to speak Russian. Nico, in theory, aside from maybe Glaive, is the player most people in the world would want to play with.
Yeah. and just that arrogant, like, or just that like very confident, like that. I mean, I think just that attracts people, you know.
Yeah. Mate, this is what people don't get. Like, this is one of the things I thought in that Last Dance document that people didn't get. Because here's the problem. This is how you can tell who someone is in their life. If someone's just the hapless loser in a bar, like, I'd love to be on a top team one day, haha, at Bud Light, anyone, like, if someone's that guy, they're going to watch The Last Dance like, Michael Jordan is a monster. Oh, he was being mean to him. What they're missing is, you know why? You know one thing people never talk about with Kobe Bryant and Michael Jordan's teams? They usually, when they had teammates that weren't very good at basketball, their teammates have their career highs playing with them. And the reason why is, imagine how confident you feel going into battle with the fucking nuke when they don't have a nuke. You feel like you can't lose. Because even if you fuck up your game, that guy might just carry the game anyway. So if you have Nico, as long as they don't destroy your confidence with their fucking mouth, as long as they can get themselves out of the way enough for that and they just play their game, you'll never be more confident when you play with that guy. You think you can't lose the game. How could you? I've got the best player in the world on my team. And he even, like, here's the thing about Nico that would make me want to play with him. I don't know if he's ever said this publicly, but Nico and the circle of people around Nico in his life think Nico's better than Simple. And you know what? I'm not going to tell him he's wrong. I can see the argument. I don't agree with it. I personally think Simple's probably the best player to ever play any FPS game. That's a Counter-Strike type game. I've never seen anyone with that raw skill, but Nico has the all-around game. Like, he has aspects where he is better than Simple, in my opinion. Only marginally. But I could see the argument, you know.
What's crazy to me about Simple is I feel like he like always gets it done. Like it didn't seem like he lost a beat with like the online era or like when the Krieg.
Yes, he really is like a superhuman, isn't he? He's like fucking Dr. Manhattan or something.
Like, it just doesn't seem like he has a kryptonite. Whereas with Nico, it doesn't really seem like he has a true kryptonite, but there's stuff that kind of like lowers.
Nico's kryptonite is the Nico in-game leader. That guy keeps fucking it. You know what? If Nico, the star player, didn't have the dickhead Nico in-game leader, what would his career be, eh? It would be a bit... You don't want majors, mate. You don't want majors.
Yeah.
Does he actually need to speak Russian, by the way? Is that like...
He doesn't have to, but the point is, like, for obvious reasons with his... Especially when he had a very intense personality... Mate, it's bad enough when people are rages anyway. If they're from a totally different culture, you're never going to get it, mate. You're never going to get it. Like, you can't expect... like, put it this way. Elijah's like the quiet honor roll student, and you're going to sit him next to a raging fucking Ukrainian kid. No, never going to work. So I just think by default, Russians are going to understand him more. And then secondly, what's the best way to say this without it getting into trouble? He kind of has to play for Na'Vi now.
Uh-oh. Yeah, well, that was actually going to be my next question.
Kind of has to play for Na'Vi. Yeah. I mean, he wants to, by the way, and I get it. Listen, if Na'Vi can be the best, yeah, you'd want to. You'd want to represent your region, your country. But also, it ain't, put it this way, it ain't as simple as leaving Mad Lions and going to Astralis. You can't just do that whenever you want.
Yeah, well, that sounds
There's a few hooks in him. There we go. How about that?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, that's always perplexed me, is why Simple is stuck with Na'Vi through thick and thin, especially since most of it has been thin. You know what I mean?
Put it this way. You have to think of it this way. Imagine you came from Silicon Valley and doing business in America, right? But then you tried to go, and the best example ever, you'll know this if you know anything about international business. The first companies were like, oh, let's go do business in China. They've got loads of money. They got fucking reamed out for years. You know, they steal your tech, they fuck you over, they do business. Like, you don't know how they operate. So in the same sense, CIS region, it's a different world, mate. Put it this way, it's the same reason why Furia players have never been in MABR. Now, they're going to tell you in interviews, I didn't want to be. Can I just look behind the camera if there's a fucking, like, a machine gun pointed at you while you say it? Because I'm just going to tell you right now. Let's just say it's speculation to keep me safe again. I speculate that some players from Furia already said yes to go to MIBR and wanted to be in MIBR, but they can't be. Again, for different reasons.
For 5-year contract reasons.
Just different reasons. No, even beyond that, the buyout would have been there, but just different reasons. Just, you know what? The deal just couldn't be done. And we'll never understand that if we come from the UK and America like you guys.
Right.
We'll never understand, because it's just not our world, you know.
We have different corruption. Must have been something like that, because there were so many teams that it felt like that were like on the cusp of number one that just needed... Like, there's so many teams that have Simple win to. It felt like
just need one more piece, right?
Yeah. And, like, especially in those times where, like, Flamey and Edward were shit in the bed. Like,
Yes.
it just feels there must have been some force there that is not on the surface.
Well, that potential MIBR team from back in the day, they might have been SK still at the time, where the Simple and Flamey were actually, like, Flamey had the
they were going to join.
He was in the airport. Like, Then maybe some machine guns got pointed or something.
Basically, here's the thing. Obviously, that's hyperbole. It's a joke. It's not really a machine gun. No, but here's the thing. You don't need a machine gun. Like, I'll tell you right now, there's a lot of things that a married man wouldn't do with a machine gun pointed at him that he'll do when his wife, like a dripping roof, just nags him over and over again for a month. He'll do a lot of shit he wouldn't do with a gun pointed against him.
Yes.
So, if you get my drift, there are other ways you can make someone want to stay. It's a bit like if I said, like, here's an obvious example. Does anyone really believe Bjergsen never thought for 1 second about leaving TSM in that last off-season? But I tell you what, I'll give you a hypothetical. This didn't happen, but it's hypothetical. Imagine Bjergsen and Reginald are negotiating. Let's pretend Lena's the one who does it all and she actually has a fucking real job and knows what she's doing. Yeah, just for fun, pretend it was Lena, in your head.
Definitely
but it's really
hypothetical
Reginald
now, yeah.
So when Reginald's there, after he tells Bjergsen how he should have played out the learning phase on Syndra versus Azir, he then goes, right, Bjergsen, anyway, this is how we're going to negotiate, right? I'm going to give you a fat 3-year contract. I'm going to give you the money, mate. I know I got you on that last deal. I wrecked you a little bit on that one, but business is business. But how about this? I'm going to give you a Hooney type deal, mate. All the money in China. And then Bjergsen goes, that ain't enough though, because you know what? In the world we live in now, mate, actually, every LCS team could offer me that. And you know what? There's even an EU team's offering me. They want to build a super team, and they're actually offering me as much money. Then Reginald goes, what about equity? Well, the other teams aren't offering that, Reginald, and the European team was not. Yeah, you know what? I'm starting to feel like I'm a TSM player. In the same sense, like, you could do things like you could give someone's family member a job in the org. You could give someone equity in the team. You could buy someone a car or get them an apartment. There's a million things you could do that aren't just raw money that could persuade someone to stay. This video was kindly supported by Dean Tanglis, Spencer Green, Whattathings, Pranogo, Matt Shakowski, Tobias Bernasconi, JDubs, Alexander Rao, Xinged, the Puyallup Tribe, Jensen Goh, Hades, Andreas Kroknes, and as always, a special thanks goes out to my boy Jerky's Minion. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Maybe you want to ask me a question in one of those video AMAs I do. Do you want teasers? Do you want to see who the next guests are on my shows? Do you want to take part in an in-depth esports discussion with moi? Well, if so, put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today in the Patreon link in the description box below.